The woods behind my neighborhood had always felt like an extension of the backyards we grew up in, a tangle of trees and undergrowth that seemed endless when you were a kid. I knew every bend in the narrow footpaths, every hollow where deer might have bedded down, every cluster of rocks that could hide a small animal. That familiarity gave me a strange confidence, the kind you only get when you've spent every summer climbing over logs, wading through streams, and cutting small trails with sticks that nobody else ever noticed. Late August had brought a warm, humid night, the kind where the air smells of dry leaves, wet moss, and the faint sweetness of ripening blackberries. The sun had disappeared behind the hills hours earlier, leaving a soft, dim light fading to darkness, but the sky still held a little warmth and color, enough that you could make out shapes in the forest without straining your eyes. A few of the neighborhood kids had wandered back into the woods that evening, drawn by some sudden impulse to play, to escape the quiet streets and the smell of asphalt heated by the day. I had followed without thinking, the thrill of hiding and running through the trees pulling me along. We decided on a game of hide and seek, the kind that always felt different when night was falling. There was no need to speak. The rules were simple, understood by all of us. One would count while the others disappeared into the brush. I chose a spot near the old fallen tree, a massive trunk that had toppled years ago and now lay half buried in moss and ferns. Its thick bark provided a solid wall behind which I could press myself, and its roots formed a tangled barricade that broke up my outline completely. I crouched low, my back against the rough wood, and listened. The game began quietly, the soft thuds of running feet and occasional rustle of leaves marking the movement of my friends. The air was heavy, warm, but not oppressive, carrying the faint scent of soil and pine. Minutes passed, and I noticed that the normal sounds of the woods were still present. The occasional snap of a twig under a small animal, the whisper of leaves as a gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead, but there was something off. A subtle tension, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trunks, but the way it moved was wrong. It was fast, far faster than any of my friends could run. Too smooth, too deliberate. It slipped between the trees without breaking a single branch, barely disturbing the ground beneath it. My heart sped up, and I froze, pressing myself tighter to the tree. I told myself it had to be one of the others, maybe trying to scare me, but the sensation didn't fit. I had played enough games in these woods to know every sound, every movement. That wasn't a friend, that wasn't a deer, and it wasn't any animal I could identify. My pulse thumped in my ears as the shape moved closer, and I realized the silence around me had deepened. The usual night sounds, the crickets, the frogs, the occasional call of a bird, had faded into something quieter, almost hollow. Then I heard the breathing. Not faint, not hidden, but a low, heavy breath that seemed right behind me. I didn't move my head, afraid that any motion might reveal my position, but I could feel it. The air shifted slightly, the faint brush of something passing nearby without touching the leaves. Panic started to rise, cold and insistent. I tried to recall the safest path back to the clearing, the familiar route where the others had run, but the woods looked different under the thin light. Shadows stretched and twisted in ways I didn't remember. The underbrush was thicker here than I thought, snagging at my clothes and scratching my arms as I edged around the tree, trying to stay low and quiet. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe one of the older kids had a flashlight hidden. Maybe someone was playing a joke. But the breathing never moved, never wavered, and it didn't stop. I took a chance and darted from behind the tree, moving as quickly as I could through the undergrowth. Branches whipped at my face, roots caught my sneakers, and I stumbled once, scraping my palms on the rough bark of another tree. The sound of my own feet on leaves sounded deafening, but I couldn't slow down. When I reached the clearing where we had started, I expected to see the familiar cluster of kids, laughing and calling out. Instead, the space was empty. The fallen logs, the circle of stones we sometimes used to sit, even the small fire pit we had built in summer months, all were unoccupied. I froze, trying to understand. My chest heaving, I scanned the edges of the clearing, the tree line, anywhere someone could have disappeared. There was nothing, just the dim outlines of trees and the pale glow of the fading sky above. I called out, my voice cracking slightly, but no answer came, only the rustle of leaves and the distant, indistinct sounds of the forest. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't know which way. The normal paths looked unfamiliar, distorted in the dark, and the earlier figure, or whatever it was, could still be out there, watching, following. Minutes felt like hours as I cautiously moved toward what I remembered as the main trail back home. Each step required careful attention. I avoided the small puddles, tried to step quietly on the dry leaves, but every crack and snap made me jump. I kept imagining movement in the corners of my vision, glimpses of dark shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. My hands were scratched and dirty, my clothes torn in small places from branches. The smell of earth and moss was overpowering now, almost pungent, and my heart would not slow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a wider path, one I knew I had walked 1,000 times during the day. Relief washed over me, tempered by the lingering dread that I might not find anyone, that everyone had disappeared while I had hidden. My legs trembled as I moved along the path, scanning the surrounding woods. I called out again, louder this time, but only my echo returned. At the edge of the woods, near the last bend that led toward the neighborhood streets, I spotted them. They were sitting on a fallen log, flushed and sweaty, faces bright with amusement and relief. They had been waiting for me, unaware of how terrified I had been. I ran toward them, stumbling over roots and loose stones, and collapsed onto the log beside them. The normalcy of their presence was a shock, grounding me after the disorienting fear of being alone in the forest. My chest heaved, and for a long while, none of us spoke. I realized then that the shadow I had seen, the heavy breathing, had never followed me onto the path. Maybe it had been an animal, maybe just a trick of the light, but the fear it had invoked was real, and the memory of it stayed with me. We left the woods together after that, moving quickly back to the streetlights, back to the familiar houses and yards. I glanced over my shoulder once, seeing the dark line of trees against the night sky. It seemed quiet again, ordinary, but the tension lingered. The awareness that something had moved there in the dark, unseen and swift, would not leave me for years. That night, the game had ended, and though I would return to the woods later, the memory of hiding behind that fallen tree, of hearing the breath that never belonged, remained a sharp and vivid marker of fear I would never forget. The woods near home were no longer just a place to play. They were a place to be careful, a place to respect, a place that could make you feel utterly alone, even when you had known it all your life. The basement of the old church smelled of damp wood and dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. I remember stepping down the creaking stairs, my foot catching on a splintered step, and the stale air pressing against my lungs, heavy and cold. The moonlight filtered in through the broken windows above, fractured and uneven, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. It was darker than I expected, darker than anything I'd been in alone before, and my chest tightened as I let my eyes adjust. The place had been abandoned for over a decade, and every surface bore the weight of neglect. Pews sat in crooked rows, some shattered, some half-toppled, their frames groaning with age. The paint peeled in long, curling strips from the walls, and the scent of mold lingered beneath it all. I had agreed to this dare to prove something, though I wasn't sure exactly what. My friends were somewhere in the shadows, laughing quietly, voices bouncing off the walls in nervous echoes, but I couldn't see them. They had dared me to hide while they tried to find me, a test of courage in a space that already felt hostile without any added fear. I moved carefully, keeping my shoes soft against the cold concrete floor, and settled behind a large support pillar near the center of the room. It was wide and square, made of thick wood, with a coating of dust so deep it left a faint imprint when I brushed against it. From here, I could see a sliver of the room, enough to catch movement but still remain concealed. My heartbeat was loud in my own ears, each beat exaggerated by the silence around me. The basement was full of small noises that seemed magnified, an occasional drip from a leaky pipe, the distant creak of a floorboard, the rustle of my own clothes as I shifted slightly. The air was close and heavy, carrying the smell of mildew and old, broken wood, and it made my stomach tighten. I waited, telling myself it was just a game, just hide and seek, but then I heard something that wasn't part of the game. A slow, deliberate set of footsteps approaching, careful and measured, too steady for my friend's usual hurried pacing. They didn't have that pause before each step, the way someone is weighing their movements against the space around them. My muscles tensed, and I pressed myself closer to the pillar, trying to make myself smaller, willing myself to disappear into the shadowed corner. The footsteps moved past the far end of the room, lingering just long enough to make me certain I wasn't imagining it. My mind raced, thinking of explanations, but none of them fit neatly. I called softly for my friends, just a low whisper, expecting their teasing laughter, but nothing answered. Silence stretched in the space between each sound, a quiet so thick it pressed against my ears. I tried to focus on the normal details around me. The dust on the pews had settled in patterns where the sunlight never reached, and in the gaps between the boards of the floor, bits of plaster had crumbled, leaving tiny mounds like miniature hills. Broken glass from the windows sparkled faintly where the moon caught it, jagged and sharp. I could see faint scratches along the walls, marks of nails or screws that had once held something in place, though nothing remained. These details should have comforted me, given me a sense of reality, but the slow rhythm of those footsteps kept my heart high in my throat, each one echoing in a way that felt intimate, targeted, as if they were measuring me against the empty room. After what felt like minutes, though it could have been longer, the steps stopped. Absolute stillness replaced the sound, but the silence was alive. I could hear the thrum of my own pulse, the shallow inhale and exhale that I tried to quiet. Shadows shifted across the room in ways that made me doubt my own perception, stretching and bending against the walls, though the source was only the moonlight through the broken windows. I tried to tell myself it was just the angles, the uneven floor and objects casting shapes, but my eyes kept flicking toward the door. The basement door at the top of the stairs had been shut when I came down, a heavy wooden slab with peeling white paint. But now it creaked slightly, moving just enough to catch the edge of my vision. I froze, holding my breath, counting each second that passed as if it would reveal something. The door opened wider on its own, swinging slowly until it hit the wall, and for a moment I was certain someone had come down the stairs. My mind screamed for me to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The air felt colder now, or maybe it was just the sudden awareness of how empty the space was. My eyes swept across the basement, noting the jagged edges of the broken pews, the columns of dust motes that floated lazily in the moonlight, the discarded remnants of what once had been. Old hymnals, a shattered crucifix, bits of fabric from what looked like altar cloths. Each detail, each object, weighed on me in a way I couldn't explain. The room felt designed to hide someone, to hold them in its corners and shadows. I knew if I moved quickly, I could reach the stairs, but I couldn't shake the certainty that I wasn't alone in the way I should have been. I stayed behind the pillar, straining to hear any sound. I tried to imagine rational explanations, the door swinging from a draft, the footsteps some trick of acoustics, but none of them settled my nerves. I thought about climbing the stairs slowly, inch by inch, but my body refused to cooperate. My mind latched onto the familiar, grounding details, the texture of the pillar against my shoulder, the coolness of the floor beneath my palms, the faint smell of wood and dust. I counted the breaths I had, the seconds ticking by, reminding myself I was still in control. Eventually, the silence became familiar, almost boring in its constancy. I risked a slow shift of my head, careful not to expose myself, and watched the basement. Nothing moved. The door remained open, and the room was still as I had first seen it, just shadows and broken furniture. I realized my friends must have gone, leaving me alone in the dark to deal with my own panic. There had been no one else. I had imagined the stalking presence, convinced myself of it, but the reality was quieter and more mundane. Fear, I understood then, could be manufactured entirely by expectation. I stood carefully, testing my weight on my legs, then moved toward the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, but the sound felt harmless now, the echo reassuring. I reached the top and pulled the door closed behind me, locking it in place with a small, rusted latch. The night air felt lighter, fresher as I stepped out into the moonlit lot beside the church. The fear had faded, leaving me with a quiet relief, the awareness that the basement held no mystery beyond its neglect. My friends were long gone, probably laughing somewhere down the street at the aftermath of their dare, and I walked home slowly, feeling a measure of pride in having faced that claustrophobic dark. The basement remained silent behind me, still and empty, a place shaped by neglect, shadows, and imagination, nothing more, nothing less. It was early March, and the air had that damp, biting quality that only rural Ohio could deliver at night. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, but the sky still held a deep, bruised blue, the kind that made shadows stretch longer than they should. I was at my cousin's family farm, the kind of place where the driveway was gravel, the fields rolled gently into dark woods, and the smell of manure mixed with wet earth lingered even after a fresh rain. My cousin and I had spent the day wandering around, checking on the fences, exploring the corn silos, and generally getting under each other's skin in the way cousins do. As the sky darkened and the chill began to settle into my bones, we agreed, without talking much about it, to play a game of hide and seek. We weren't kids anymore, but competitive streaks die hard. The farm storage sheds were perfect for it. The biggest shed was at the far edge of the property. Its exterior was streaked with rust and peeling paint, a pale blue that had once been cheerful but was now dull and mottled. The door creaked when we pushed it open, a long, groaning sound that seemed louder than it had any right to be. Inside, the air hit me first, thick with the smell of oil, rotting wood, and dust that had settled for years. Old machinery leaned against the walls, half covered with tarps, and stacks of broken crates formed narrow corridors between piles of forgotten tools. There were old barrels, some dented and leaking a dark, viscous liquid that smelled faintly of gasoline. The floor was uneven, littered with splintered wood and scattered nails. I slipped on a patch of sawdust and nearly went down, my hands catching on a stack of crates. My cousin laughed somewhere behind me. I could hear it, but I couldn't see him. That laugh was the starting gun, the signal that the game had begun. I darted deeper into the shed, choosing a narrow gap between a row of old tractors and a pile of crates. The shadows clung to the corners, thick and dense, moving as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I crouched low, the cold concrete biting into my knees, and tried to slow my breathing. I listened. At first, there was nothing but the soft scratching of rats, tiny claws against wood, and the faint hum of distant wind through broken windows. The smell was overpowering. Oil and rust and mold and wet hay mingled, filling my nose with a tangible heaviness. My cousin's footsteps moved somewhere beyond the tractors, the sound rhythmic, confident, easy. I stayed still, the darkness pressing against me, making my skin itch. Then I heard it. Not a human sound, not my cousin, not anything I could name easily. A low, deep growl came from the shadows beyond the crates. I froze so hard I thought my body would crack. It wasn't the growl of a dog, it was too deep, too guttural, reverberating through the air in a way that made the hair on my arms stand straight. My heart kicked into overdrive, loud and rapid, drowning out the rats, the creaking of the old shed, the distant hum of wind. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs were locked. Whatever it was large. I could feel its presence before I could see it, a weight pressing against the edges of the shadows, moving just out of sight. Each step it took made the floorboards creak and groan, uneven and unpredictable. I could hear the air shift as it passed close by, the metallic tang of something wet and heavy brushing against the crates. I thought about yelling, but my voice was gone. My mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came out. The growl faded slightly, retreating, but then another sound followed, lighter this time, shuffling, deliberate, as if it was testing me, feeling the space I occupied. My cousin was somewhere in the shed, probably enjoying the hunt, oblivious to the tension creeping into my chest. I could see his outline when a shaft of moonlight cut through a cracked window. He was moving with casual confidence, searching, unaware of the shifting threat somewhere in the corners of the shed. I wanted to warn him, to push him out, but the words wouldn't form, and the growl returned, closer, slower, heavier, like the sound of someone or something breathing through the shadows. I remember the smell hit me again, stronger, rank, acrid. It made my eyes water, and I had to blink rapidly to clear the sting. I could feel the sweat running down my spine despite the chill, cold and wet in the small of my back. I shifted slightly to get a better look down the narrow path between the tractors and crates, and a shadow moved just at the edge of my vision. Not fast, not sudden, just deliberate, heavy, methodical. My chest tightened. I couldn't see its shape clearly, but it was solid, undeniably real, and moving with intent. I swallowed, trying to calm the tremor in my hands, and prayed silently that my cousin would find me soon. Then I heard him, finally. His footstep closer, slower, familiar. I froze, and for a moment, relief washed over me. I could move again. He found me behind the crates, his laughter quiet now, relieved or victorious, I couldn't tell. I bolted, lunging past him, heading for the door, the exit. That's when the footsteps began behind me, irregular, heavy, louder than mine, pounding against the wooden floor. Not mine, not his. They didn't follow a pattern. They weren't even the sound of a person running. But they were close, following, keeping pace with every step I took. My heart slammed against my ribcage, each breath sharp and ragged. I didn't dare look behind me. I couldn't. I ran toward the open door, over splintered wood and old nails, hearing the steps continue, and I knew I had to get out. I reached the threshold, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. The dark blue sky above felt impossibly distant, but safe. I turned only slightly, just enough to see the shadows shift and retreat, just enough to know I wasn't imagining it. I didn't wait for him. I ran straight to the farmhouse, into the warm kitchen light, the smell of old wood and home overpowering the shed's decay. My cousin followed, laughing nervously, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't speak. I just collapsed onto the floor, hands shaking, chest heaving. We stayed in that kitchen for what felt like hours, listening to the empty night beyond the windows, the wind through the trees, the occasional clatter of old farm tools disturbed by rats or wind. Nothing else came, no further growls, no footsteps. The shed was quiet once again. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I never went back near that shed after dark. I didn't need to. The memory was vivid enough. The smell of oil and rot, the creaking wood underfoot, the shadows shifting just beyond sight, and the weight of something large, breathing, moving where it shouldn't have been. It was real, undeniably real, and it had been there when no one else could see it. The next morning, sunlight streaming over the fields, the shed looked innocuous, just another old building filled with broken equipment. But I knew better. I knew that in the dark, when the smell and shadows were right, it could still be there, waiting, heavy and deliberate, pressing against the edges of reality. I never played hide and seek there again. I can feel the uneven ground beneath my sneakers as I step carefully between overgrown shrubs and loose rocks. The quarry is silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint drip of water somewhere far below. It's deep, abandoned, and jagged, with sheer walls of gray stone that rise like cliffs in every direction. My friends had been joking around near the campsite earlier, their flashlights swinging across the brush, but now the night is heavy, and I'm alone in a corner of the pit, crouched behind a boulder that's slick with moss and damp from the humidity. The air smells like wet earth and decaying leaves. My heart is already beating faster than it should. We had thought it would be fun, hide and seek in the middle of an overgrown quarry at 1 a.m. But now that I'm actually here, I'm wishing I hadn't agreed. I can see the edge of the pit above me, dimly lit by the moon, and the shadowed shapes of twisted shrubs and jagged rocks. The ground slopes unpredictably, small stones shifting under my weight when I move. I barely dare to breathe. The plan had been simple: run down into the pit, find a spot to hide, and wait for someone to come find me. It seemed harmless in the daylight, when we joked about who could hide the best, who would last the longest. But now the darkness has swallowed the quarry whole. Everything is distorted, and every movement, every sound feels amplified. A branch snaps somewhere off to my left, and my stomach tightens. I press my back against the boulder, trying to make myself as small as possible. My flashlight lies at the top of the slope, forgotten in the scramble to hide, and without it, the world is all shadows. That's when I notice something. Across the pit, just on the edge of the moonlight, a shape moves. At first, I convince myself it's a deer or some raccoon, something that belongs here. But it doesn't move like any animal I've ever seen. It's tall, hunched, and fast, faster than any person could reasonably move across the uneven stone. Every time I shift my gaze, it seems to adjust its position, always just at the edge of what I can see. It doesn't make noise, at least none that I can detect immediately, but it has this unnatural presence, like it's aware of me in a way no person could be in such darkness. A breeze picks up and carries a sound that twists in my chest. It's soft at first, almost a hiss, like wind through narrow cracks, but then I hear it more clearly. Whispers, barely formed, almost sounding like words. I strain to make them out, and they curl into something like a growl, trying to imitate human speech. My pulse jumps. My mind scrambles for a rational explanation. Wind through rocks, a branch scraping against stone. But even as I tell myself that, the shape across the pit seems to respond to me, moving closer as if it's drawn by my presence. I try to keep calm. The last thing I need is to panic in a place where a misstep could send me sliding down to a jagged edge. I creep along the boulder, hugging the stone to stay out of sight. My fingers graze rough moss and sharp edges. I want to stay hidden, but the thought of the figure watching me is unbearable. I glance again, and it's closer now, almost on the edge of the slope, moving in a way that is impossible, quick, precise, like it knows every crevice and loose stone in the quarry. I force myself to breathe slowly, listening to the whispering wind, convincing myself I'm imagining it. The thought of my friends keeps me from bolting. They're supposed to be here. I can hear the faint crunch of leaves where I remember seeing them before, or at least I hope it's them. I risk peeking around the boulder, and for a heartbeat, I see nothing familiar. The flashlight beam that had been carried off into the darkness is gone. The pit feels like a trap now, walls closing in, the uneven ground threatening to betray every step. The shape hasn't left. It mirrors me, shifting in the shadows, stopping when I stop, moving when I move. I can't stay. Every rational instinct tells me to climb back to the campsite, but the path is treacherous. Loose stones, moss-covered ledges, jagged edges ready to tear through my sneakers. I inch along the boulder, trying to stay as silent as possible, listening for any sign of my friends. The whispers swirl around me again, and I realize they aren't forming words I can understand, but they carry rhythm, almost like laughter warped by the dark. I don't know if it's meant for me, or if it's just echoes in the pit, but it makes my skin crawl. I finally make a decision. I can't stay behind the boulder. I push off and start moving back toward where I remember the slope leading up to the campsite. Every step is calculated, careful. My body feels tight, every muscle ready to react. I keep glancing behind me, and the figure is there every time, just a shadow now, blending into rocks and brush, moving impossibly fast, mirroring my every motion. It's terrifyingly precise. My stomach knots, but I force myself to keep going. Halfway up the slope, I stumble over a loose rock and my ankle twists. Pain shoots through my leg, and I hit the ground hard, scraping my palms and knee. I hear movement behind me, a rush of speed. Panic rises. I push myself up and run, limping, every step tearing at my ankle. The slope ends, and I finally break through the brush onto a clearer patch where moonlight hits more evenly. I can see the edge of the campsite now. The tents, the discarded sleeping bags, the cooler left open in the chaos of our game. I run the last few feet, adrenaline burning in my chest. I reach the campsite, and the relief hits me like ice water. The shape is gone. I scan the pit, the shadows, every rock, and there's nothing. My friends are there, sitting by the fire, asleep in their bags, completely oblivious. My heart is still hammering, sweat dripping down my back. I check around the campsite for anything unusual. Every pile of rocks, every bush, every shadow. Nothing. Just the quiet night, the soft chirping of insects, the distant rustle of trees. I sit down hard, trying to catch my breath, still scanning the quarry below. My friends stir and ask if I'm okay. I nod, not trusting my voice to stay steady. I don't tell them what I saw. I can't. It would sound insane. I keep thinking about the shape, the way it moved, the whispers that carried over the stone. I convince myself it had to be someone else, a hiker maybe, exploring the pit as I had, someone as reckless as we were, maybe hiding too, but the speed, the movement, the way it mirrored me, it doesn't make sense. Eventually, I calm down enough to lie in my sleeping bag, staring at the moonlit sky, feeling the chill of the night seep through the fabric. I replay every moment over and over. Every shadow, every whispered sound. I tell myself I imagined some of it, that exhaustion and fear warped what I saw. I force my eyes shut. Morning comes slowly, pale light filtering over the quarry. I hike carefully around the pits, checking every boulder and slope I had moved along the night before. There's no trace of anyone, no footprints, nothing to explain the terror I felt. I never go back to that quarry after that night. The memory stays sharp, vivid. The wet smell of stone and leaves, the whispers in the wind, the impossibly fast figure watching from across the pit. I avoid the idea of night games in places like that. I learned the hard way that even familiar spaces, abandoned and overgrown, can become completely unknown when darkness falls. And that night, alone behind a boulder in the quietest, deepest part of the quarry, I understood exactly how small and vulnerable I really was. Halloween had already bled into the deeper hours of the night when we arrived at the park. It was late, the air damp and sharp with the chill that comes before the first frost. The streets leading up to it had been nearly empty, lined with skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the dim light from the single street lamp outside the fence. I parked a little ways back, heart beating faster than it should have, and looked at the sprawling lot ahead. The park had been closed for years, a relic from a time when families crowded the midway, when laughter echoed over the carnival music. Now it sat abandoned, gates chained, paint peeling, metal rusting, and the Ferris wheel loomed at the far end, its skeletal frame swaying slightly in the wind, creaking like a groaning spine. My friends dared me to play hide and seek before the night ended. I was supposed to be the first to hide. I didn't hesitate, mostly because my curiosity outweighed caution. I slipped past the broken gates and onto the gravel path, trying to keep my steps quiet. The smell hit me immediately: wet rust, decaying wood, the faint sourness of old trash trapped in corners. The midway stretched out before me in muted grays and browns, the colors of the rides faded and chipped, banners hanging loose from poles. The carousel sat crooked, some of its horses missing limbs, others tipped at odd angles. The lights were long gone, leaving shadows that shifted as the wind moved through the hollow stalls. I started walking slowly, scanning for the first hiding place. I found a broken ticket booth near the entrance. Its window was smashed, glass shards littering the ground inside. The wood was warped, splintered in several places, but it formed a small alcove that would conceal me from anyone passing the main path. I climbed in, careful not to make noise, and crouched low. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I could see the Ferris wheel in the distance, still swaying in the breeze. The chains clinked softly, a sound that shouldn't have been there, and I froze, listening. At first, I thought it was the wind. The benches by the food stalls rattled, and I saw shadows dance across the cracked asphalt as the wind picked up. I told myself it was nothing, but the longer I sat, the more I noticed small movements out of the corner of my eye. A swing jerked back and forth slowly, though no one had touched it. A shadow crossed the Ferris wheel's seats, quick and precise, and I blinked, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the moonlight. Whispers brushed the edges of hearing, carried by the wind, or so I hoped, soft syllables that vanished when I tried to listen. I pressed my palms to my ears to block the sound, my chest tightening. I shifted slightly in the booth, and that's when I saw it. Across the midway, a figure darted along the path, unnaturally fast, low to the ground, moving from one shadow to the next without the slightest sound. The shape was human, but the way it moved didn't make sense, too fluid, too precise. I froze completely, gripping the edges of the ticket booth, trying to see if my eyes were playing tricks. The figure disappeared behind the carousel before I could focus on any details. My mind raced. It wasn't one of my friends. None of them could have moved like that, and the thought of someone else being here made my stomach twist. I waited for what felt like forever, counting each second, heart hammering against my ribs. The wind shifted, carrying more whispers, and I realized they weren't coming from one place. They were echoes bouncing off the broken structures, every loose panel and bent railing amplifying the sound. My throat felt tight, dry, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing even. The amusement park, once bright and lively in my imagination, felt alive in a completely different way, empty yet attentive, a space that had settled into its own rhythm of decay and silence. After a few minutes, I made the decision to leave the booth. Staying there felt impossible. I eased myself out, moving as quietly as I could, sticking close to the walls of the nearest stalls. The wind carried the metallic scent of rust and damp earth, and each step crunched against broken glass or splintered wood. I tried to keep my focus on the path ahead, on the Ferris wheel as a landmark, but every shadow I passed seemed to twitch just before I could see it fully. I passed the carousel carefully, keeping my body low. The horses stared down at me with chipped paint eyes, the edges of their forms catching the moonlight in a way that made them look alive. I slowed near the funhouse. Its entrance was a yawning black mouth, a frame of peeling paint and twisted metal. I considered hiding there, but the smell was overpowering, mold, rot, and something else I couldn't identify. I realized I had been holding my breath, and exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain slightly from my shoulders. I forced myself to move past it. The Ferris wheel got closer with each step, the creaking growing louder. I could see the seats swinging gently, though there was no one in them. I stayed near the shadow of the support beams, trying not to think about the figure I had seen earlier. I didn't want to imagine it jumping from seat to seat, tracking me, but my mind kept pulling me back to it. I made a slow, deliberate path around the base, looking for any gaps in the fence that would lead out. Finally, I found a section where the chain link was bent. It was enough for me to squeeze through, and I did, scraping my sleeve but not making enough noise to announce my presence. The wind hit me outside the park, sharp and biting, and I inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp night air. I didn't stop running, not yet. I made it to the car and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, adrenaline making my limbs clumsy. Once inside, I locked the doors and slumped in the seat, heart still racing, ears straining for any sound beyond the faint creaking from the Ferris wheel in the distance. The drive home was silent. The streets were empty, lined with trees that scratched against the sides of the car as I passed. My mind went over everything, the shadows, the whispers, the figure moving with impossible speed. I told myself it had to be a trespasser, someone hiding in the park for reasons I couldn't understand. There were no monsters here, no ghosts, just someone or something that shouldn't have been moving like that in the dark. By the time I got back to the safety of my neighborhood, the tension had started to fade. I parked and sat for a moment, letting my breathing slow, the rational part of my mind taking over. I realized I hadn't been brave or clever, I had been lucky. Everything I had seen could be explained by fear and darkness, by the way our minds fill in gaps when there's no real information. The park wasn't alive, and the figure wasn't supernatural. But the memory of moving through it, the smell, the shadows, the metallic creaks, would stay with me. I didn't go back to the park. The dare ended the night, and my friends laughed when I told them I made it out first, not because I was brave, but because I had left as soon as I could. The Ferris wheel, the broken stalls, the dark midway, and the figure I never got a proper look at stayed behind in the abandoned park, waiting silently for the next person to wander in. The memory was enough, and I was content to let it stay there, untouched, a quiet terror held only by the night and my imagination. I had spent the entire day hiking with my friends through the dense forest of northern Michigan, the sun heavy on our backs and the trail thick with roots and fallen leaves. By the time we reached the cabin, I was aching from head to toe, my legs stiff and my backpack feeling twice its weight. The cabin was old but solid, a simple wooden structure set a short walk from the dirt road that led in from the main highway. Its exterior was weathered, gray from years of rain and snow, with a thin trail of smoke curling from a metal chimney. Inside, it smelled of pine and the faint mustiness of a place that hadn't seen many visitors recently. There was a single main room with a table, a few chairs, a wood stove, and a loft that stretched over half the floor. Stairs led down into a storage basement that was unfinished, dark, and narrow. We dropped our gear, set up sleeping bags, and I felt the satisfaction of exhaustion settling into my bones. After dinner and a few quiet hours of unpacking and cleaning up the cabin, someone jokingly suggested we play hide and seek. The idea seemed absurd at first, but fatigue and a bit of childish competitiveness made it sound entertaining. No one expected anything scary, and I was the first to agree, moving toward the loft as a hiding spot. I had just climbed the narrow ladder, trying to find a corner where I could lie flat behind some stored camping supplies, when the stillness of the cabin settled over me. From above, the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, and the thin moonlight coming through a high window made everything feel slightly off-kilter, the shadows stretching long and soft against the walls. As I positioned myself, I heard a noise from the basement below. At first, I assumed it was a raccoon or perhaps a squirrel that had made its way in through a small gap near the foundation. The scratching was light, almost tentative, the kind of noise that makes you pause and listen, thinking it's nothing significant. I tried to ignore it and focus on remaining unseen. The sound persisted, though, and I realized it wasn't random. It moved with intention, a soft, careful shuffling across the bare wooden floor, a noise that seemed to track the space beneath me. I pressed myself lower behind the pile of boxes and old camping gear, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, a sound I had heard in the woods 1,000 times before. But the rhythm felt too deliberate, the scratching too precise, like someone was learning the floor, testing it, staying just out of sight. Minutes passed. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks in the dark. Then I noticed a flicker at the edge of my vision, a movement at the edge of the loft. I froze, trying to breathe quietly, my heart suddenly thrumming in a way that made my ears ring. It vanished instantly, leaving only the soft creak of the loft floorboards settling. My friends' laughter and shuffling had faded hours ago, replaced by the quiet of the cabin and the far-off hum of cicadas outside. The air was warmer than it should have been, and I could hear the faint sound of the trees swaying, brushing against the roof and walls. Every noise felt magnified, every creak of wood like a signal of someone else being there. I wasn't supposed to feel fear, but I did, a cold tightness curling in my stomach as I considered the possibility that the sound wasn't an animal at all. I stayed where I was, waiting for the minutes to pass, counting silently, telling myself that eventually the game would end and someone would find me. The scratching returned, softer this time, moving slowly across the basement floor in short, measured steps. My first instinct was to look over the edge of the loft, to catch a glimpse of what it could be, but I forced myself to stay put. The flicker returned once more at the edge of my loft, just at the corner of the moonlight, a shadow that was sharper and more defined than the rest of the darkness. My stomach dropped. The movement was brief, deliberate, almost human in its timing. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there, only the worn wooden railing of the loft and the uneven floorboards below. My pulse raced as I considered calling out, but the thought of breaking the silence made me hesitate. I didn't want to be the first to move, to alert whoever or whatever was down there. But the rational part of me told me there was no one, just a stray animal, the creak of the cabin settling in the night. Maybe even my imagination stretched thin from the long hike and the dark. Time dragged. I felt trapped, a tension pressing in from the low ceiling and the narrow loft. I shifted slightly, testing the floor beneath me, making sure I had enough space to sit upright without knocking anything over. Every minor noise, the scrape of a branch outside, the settling of the walls, the hum of the refrigerator box someone had left in the corner, felt amplified, like it was all waiting for me to make a move. I realized I hadn't heard any laughter, any breathing, any signs that my friends were moving around in the cabin at all. It was too quiet, and the silence weighed heavily, pressing against my ears. The idea that I was alone, truly alone, crept into my mind and refused to leave. Eventually, I convinced myself that I couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, carefully, I climbed down the ladder, my hands trembling slightly as I touched the worn wood. I moved as quietly as I could, testing the floorboards before shifting my weight. When I reached the main room, I expected some sense of relief, a laugh or a smile from one of my friends, maybe someone teasing me for hiding too well. But the cabin was empty, except for the soft rustle of sleeping bags and the faint outline of my friends under blankets. They were all asleep, unmoving, perfectly still. I walked past each one, checking to make sure they were breathing, their faces calm in the pale moonlight. The basement door remained closed, the sound of scratching long gone. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for anything, but there was only silence, nothing that suggested someone had been moving there at all. I couldn't explain the noises, the shadow, the way the loft had felt so charged with presence, but everything was physically normal. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing missing. I settled into my sleeping bag on the cabin floor, letting my body relax for the first time since I had climbed into the loft. Outside, the forest murmured softly, wind moving through the pines, a distant owl calling once before returning to the quiet. I realized that whatever had made the sounds and the movement had been small enough to remain unseen, clever enough to make me think it was watching. Or maybe it hadn't existed in the way I imagined at all, and the fear had been mine, a combination of isolation, exhaustion, and the natural tension of a dark forest cabin. Either way, I felt the weight of the night settle over me, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can feel unfamiliar, how a simple game can transform into something that presses at the edge of reason. I didn't move again, letting the darkness and the soft breathing of my friends lull me into sleep, the memory of the flicker and the scratching lingering like the faintest ache in the back of my mind. I had never been comfortable with dares, but that night, at my friend's birthday party in June 2014, peer pressure felt heavier than usual. The house we were in had always been strange to me, even before the renovations started. It had sat empty for years, a neglected two-story in suburban New Jersey with windows clouded in grime, shingles warped by rain, and a front door that creaked so sharply it sounded like a warning every time it moved. My friend's parents had begun fixing it up, but the work was uneven. Some rooms looked almost new, with fresh paint and smooth floors, while others were half-finished, with peeling wallpaper, exposed insulation, and dust covering every surface. The house smelled of sawdust, old carpet, and faint mildew. The dare was simple in words: hide in the house until sunrise while the others tried to find me. Simple enough, except the house itself was a maze of uneven staircases, half-built walls, and odd corners that swallowed light. I agreed, my stomach tight with both apprehension and the desire not to look weak in front of my friends. Everyone else scattered as I took my first steps up the stairs, the wooden boards groaning under my weight. I felt the unevenness immediately. Some steps had been sanded and shined, others were splintered, forcing me to step lightly. I decided on the attic. It was partially renovated, with a low ceiling that slanted in places, and a single window facing the backyard. Dust hung in the air, floating in the beam of light from the hall below. The window was half covered by sheets of plywood leaning against the wall, making the room feel claustrophobic, but it also gave me a small sense of safety. I could see shadows move across the floorboards from the light below, without being easily seen myself. Once I settled in a corner, I realized how quiet the house had become once the party noise faded. The laughter, the footsteps, the music, all of it had been replaced by a subtle, almost tangible stillness. Every sound I made felt exaggerated. My own breathing was loud. The soft shift of my weight across the floorboards sounded like a hammer against stone. I reminded myself to stay calm. The attic smelled strongly of dust and old wood, and the air was thick, hot from the trapped summer heat and the walls that hadn't seen the sun in years. Then I heard it, a soft footstep above me on the roof. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The house creaked constantly, but this sound had rhythm like deliberate pacing. Another step, slow, cautious, then a faint scrape. I froze. My heart beat hard in my chest. I tried to rationalize it as someone checking the roof for a dare, maybe one of my friends trying to scare me. But the sound didn't match anyone I knew. It was too methodical. Then came the whispers, faint but clear. Someone, or something, was saying my name. Marcus. The tone was soft, almost casual, like a friend calling me from another room. But it made my skin crawl. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick, maybe one of my friends standing just out of sight, knowing I could hear them. I wanted to convince myself it was part of the game. My throat went dry, and I gripped the edge of a nearby beam for support. I waited, straining to hear any further sounds, trying to keep my breathing steady. The whispers stopped, and there was silence again, thick and heavy. I tried to convince myself to climb down, to end the game, but the attic corner I was in felt safer than the open hallways below. I stayed, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, scanning the half-renovated space for movement. Then I noticed the shadow. At first, it was subtle, stretching along the wall near the attic entrance. It didn't belong to anyone below. I could tell because it didn't move in sync with the creaking floorboards or the light from the hall. Slowly, it took a shape, taller than I expected, and moved with an odd, independent rhythm, almost gliding. I didn't see a figure stepping into the room. It was just there, a shape that wasn't mine, that didn't belong. My stomach twisted. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was glued to the dusty floor. The shadow didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It just stayed near the entrance. I realized I could hear more subtle noises now. The faint scraping of something against wood, soft thumps from the walls around me. Each sound made me flinch, my mind racing for explanations. I tried to rationalize again, maybe a loose board shifting, maybe a raccoon outside, anything that didn't make me feel completely exposed and trapped. But the sense of being watched, of not being alone, was overwhelming. Eventually, I decided I had to leave the attic. My legs shook as I climbed down, testing each step cautiously. The stairs felt more unstable than ever. Every groan of the wood made me jump. I kept my eyes on the shadows cast by the weak lights below, moving slowly, deliberately. The house felt alive in a way I had never noticed before, each room stretching endlessly, each dark corner hiding potential threats. When I reached the main floor, the house seemed quieter than before, almost sterile in comparison to the attic. I moved toward the front door, my hands brushing against dust-covered walls, feeling the uneven textures of peeling wallpaper. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't stop myself. Shadows shifted in the hallways, exaggerated by the weak light, forming strange angles and silhouettes that mimicked movement. My pulse raced as I reached the front door. Outside, the air was humid, carrying the smell of wet grass and the faint odor of asphalt from the quiet street. I realized then that my friends had scattered entirely. No one was laughing, no one was hiding, they were gone. I didn't wait to understand why. I ran down the steps, across the yard, feeling the grass brush against my legs, feeling the unevenness of the ground beneath my sneakers. By the time I returned to the street, I was shaking. My chest burned, my arms ached from tension, and my head felt light. I looked back at the house once. The windows were dark, the structure silent, almost like it had absorbed everything inside it and exhaled nothing. My friends eventually came back, some of them laughing nervously, others looking pale, but everyone agreed the house felt wrong. Some said they had seen strange movement through windows. Others swore the stairs and floors groaned, even when no one was walking. The birthday dare had turned into a shared unease that none of us could shake. I never hid in that house again. Even years later, driving past it felt unsettling. The half-renovated walls, the dust-covered floors, and the heavy, still air of the attic stayed in my mind. It wasn't a story of ghosts or curses, but it didn't need to be. The fear came from the place itself, from the way a familiar space could become unpredictable, untrustworthy, and overwhelming when the rules of normality were broken. The attic, the shadows, the sounds, They were enough to remind me how small and fragile control can feel. The house remained standing, slowly finished by my friend's parents. But for me, it stayed haunted by the memory of that night. The way ordinary things can become terrifying when the context shifts, and when you realize just how easily the familiar can turn alien. I had been drawn to abandoned buildings for years, the thrill of walking through spaces that people had left behind, full of history and decay. That December night in 2007, my urban exploring group dared me to hide in the condemned wing of an old Detroit hospital. The wing had been closed for decades. Locals whispered about patient deaths, strange disappearances, and nurses who vanished without a trace. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but I liked to push my own limits. I wanted the adrenaline rush, the quiet echo of my own footsteps in empty corridors. I slipped through a broken window and moved down the first hallway. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, uneven shadows across the peeling linoleum. Paint hung from the walls in ragged strips, and the smell of mildew mixed with rust and old disinfectant hung thick in the air. I could feel the chill settle into my bones as I stepped over broken tiles and debris. My breath came out in small puffs, loud against the silence, and each echo bounced back from the concrete walls. I found an old, rusted hospital bed tucked into a corner, just off the main corridor. It was perfect. I crouched behind it, trying to make myself as small as possible, listening to the soft sound of my own breathing. The other members of the group had spread out to find me. I had been hiding for 10 minutes when I first noticed something that made me pause. Down the hallway, where the light dimmed to almost nothing, a figure crouched in a doorway. It was impossibly thin, hunched at an odd angle, and completely still. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the shape of it, the way it moved, was not right. It didn't step forward, it didn't run, it didn't even seem to blink, but there was a tension in its posture that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My pulse spiked, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing shallow so I wouldn't make a sound. I whispered my friends' names, expecting a laugh, a shout, anything. Nothing. Silence stretched, heavy and complete. My stomach twisted, and for the first time that night, I felt a real, raw fear. I could hear the soft scrape of my jeans against the bed frame as I shifted slightly, and I realized just how loud even that tiny sound could be in a space this empty. The figure didn't move from the doorway, but every instinct screamed at me that it had noticed me. Minutes passed. I told myself I was imagining it, that the flickering lights, the shadows, the rumors about this place were all feeding my imagination. I tried to slow my heart, to remind myself that I had hidden in worse places. But then a faint sound came from down the hall, almost like a scratching or something dragging across the floor. My skin prickled and I froze. The figure in the doorway had shifted slightly. It was still thin, impossibly so, but it had turned its head in my direction. I could see the outline of a shoulder, the curve of an elbow, all in an angle that shouldn't have been humanly possible. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I should crawl back toward the main entrance, if I should stay hidden until someone came for me, if I should call out again. Every second stretched longer than the last. I realized that the building didn't just feel abandoned. It felt alive, as if it were watching me, listening, waiting. The soft hum of the emergency lights overhead mixed with the distant creaks and groans of the structure settling around me. The rusted pipes moaned. The peeling linoleum shifted under its own weight. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to peek around the edge of the bed. The figure had moved closer, its motion smooth, deliberate, careful. Not running, not walking, just moving in a way that made no sound except the faintest scrape of something against the floor. My stomach knotted, and I realized I could not stay here any longer. I had to get out. I pressed my back against the wall, keeping low, and edged along the hallway. Every step seemed amplified, every tiny sound threatening to give me away. My eyes flicked to the figure repeatedly. It hadn't followed me yet, but it was watching. I kept my hands against the wall, feeling the cool, grimy paint under my fingertips, trying to move silently across broken tiles and scattered debris. I reached a junction where the hallway split. The emergency light above me flickered violently, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I froze, heart pounding, listening. A soft scrape came from somewhere behind me. I couldn't see the figure now, but I could feel its presence and the weight of it pressed against my chest. I fumbled along the wall, trying to find the stairwell. My hands scraped against exposed pipes, old electrical boxes, jagged edges of torn drywall. The floor tilted slightly under loose tiles, and I had to balance carefully. Finally, I found the stairwell. It was narrow and steep, coated in dust and dirt. I descended slowly, holding the railing, trying to keep quiet. The air grew colder as I went down, and the smell of mold was stronger here. I reached the bottom and found another hallway. My pulse had slowed slightly, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the shadows. As I crept forward, my foot caught on something hard. I stumbled, heart leaping, and glanced down. A small piece of metal pipe, probably fallen from the ceiling, lay under my shoe. I froze, waiting, listening. Nothing. No movement, no scraping, no figure. I exhaled slowly, telling myself I had gotten away. I edged along the wall until I could see a faint light at the end of the corridor. An exit, maybe, or a window to the outside. I hurried, moving carefully, my shoes scraping softly against the concrete. When I finally reached the small room at the end of the hall, I noticed something scratched into the wall. The letters were jagged, deep, and uneven. "Found you." I froze, staring at it. My hands shook as I reached out, touching the wall. Every nerve in my body screamed at me. I hadn't seen anyone else in this wing. The figure had been real. It had been watching me. I ran then, not stopping until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, my lungs burning from the run. I never went back. I didn't want to. The hospital still stands, still decaying, still full of shadows and corners that should have remained empty. I stopped urban exploring after that night. The memory of the figure, impossibly thin and impossibly still, crouched in the doorway, stayed with me for years. It wasn't supernatural. It didn't need to be. The fear it brought was real enough. I don't know who, or what it was, but I will never forget the feeling of being watched in the dark, alone in a place that should have been empty, and finding that note scratched into the wall. "Found you." I left Detroit shortly after that, moving across the state. I still think about that night whenever I hear about abandoned buildings, about the allure of empty spaces. I know now that some dares aren't worth taking. Some explorations aren't adventures, they're warnings. That wing of the hospital will always be part of me, a reminder of how real fear can be when it's human, when it's grounded in silence and shadows and someone, or something, watching you in the dark. I remember walking up the cracked concrete steps of the old elementary school, the night air heavy and cold, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up without warning. My friends had dared me to play hide and seek inside before it was torn down. I was never the bravest in our group. I usually hung back, watched from the sidelines, but something about the dare made my chest tighten with a mix of fear and excitement. The building itself had been empty for years, and the small town whispered about it, mostly because of a janitor who had died in the basement decades ago. The thought of him lying somewhere down there used to make us uncomfortable, but now it felt like the dare's entire point. The front doors were locked, but a side entrance had rotted enough for us to push through. The hinges groaned, a long, low sound that echoed through the empty hallways. Inside, the smell hit me immediately: wet plaster, mildew, and the faint metallic scent of rusted pipes. The lights had all long since been cut, but the small battery-operated flashlights my friends carried lit narrow paths along the peeling paint and graffiti-stained walls. I could hear my own footsteps against the linoleum, but they sounded distant, as if someone else were walking with me. The building was quiet in a way that made the normal sounds of a school, slamming lockers, laughter, the scraping of chairs, feel impossible and unreal. Every small noise felt amplified, every drop of water from a leaky pipe sounding like a gunshot. My friends scattered as soon as the countdown ended. I pressed myself against the wall, flashlight clutched tightly, scanning the hallway. I had never been in the basement before. It was through a set of double doors at the far end of the hall, one of them hanging off its hinges, revealing stairs that disappeared into darkness. The air coming up from below smelled colder, damper, and it carried a faint chemical sharpness, like the cleaners the janitor used to keep under the sink. My gut twisted, but I wanted to win. I moved slowly down the steps, my shoes squeaking against the concrete, the sound swallowed by the hollow space around me. The basement was enormous and low-ceilinged, lined with lockers that had been pried open, their contents long since removed. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, the hum low and irregular, giving the impression that shadows were moving just beyond the edge of vision. Paint peeled from the walls in large sheets, curling like dead leaves. Water dripped from the ceiling into small puddles, each drop a sharp note in the otherwise oppressive silence. I made my way to the janitor's closet at the back, a narrow space with a half-broken door, the kind of space nobody could accidentally spot. I slid inside, pressing my back to the wall, careful to keep my breathing quiet. I could hear the muffled shouts of my friends as they searched the floor above, but beneath them, the basement felt separate from the world. I stayed still, counting my breaths, listening. After a while, I realized there were other sounds. Footsteps, faint and deliberate, moving across the concrete. I could hear a scraping, like something heavy being dragged, but nothing else. The air seemed to thicken, and my flashlight flickered, leaving me half in darkness. I told myself it was my imagination, that my friends were just upstairs, maybe messing with me. But then I heard the whispers. Low, deliberate, words I couldn't make out. They didn't match my friends' voices. I froze, straining to listen, trying to figure out what to do. My body refused to move. My mind raced. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shape at the far end of the hall. It was tall, unmoving, and impossible to miss. I blinked, and it seemed closer, though I hadn't seen it move. My stomach turned over. My mind ran through every rational explanation I had. Maybe it was a coat rack, a mannequin left behind, some trick of the flickering light. I convinced myself of that repeatedly, but my pulse refused to slow. The shape disappeared when I blinked again, leaving only the flickering hallway, damp walls, and that distant scraping sound. It was closer now, the sound moving along the concrete toward the stairs. My chest ached, my limbs felt like lead. I stayed in that closet for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. My friends' voices occasionally called out names, calling for me, but none of it sounded real. It was layered, distant, as if echoing through something hollow. My mind refused to believe it was them, and I felt the crushing weight of isolation, the kind that comes when you're alone in a place that should feel safe but doesn't. The air smelled of rust and decay, wet concrete, something sour I couldn't name. The sound of footsteps continued, methodical and silent in a way that made the floorboards above seem less alive than the concrete under my shoes. Every instinct told me to stay perfectly still, to breathe shallowly and hope for normalcy. Eventually, the steps stopped near the top of the stairs. I could hear a faint shuffle, then nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. My muscles cramped from staying pressed against the wall. My flashlight flickered once more, leaving me in near-complete darkness, then back on. And in that brief moment, I realized the hallway was empty. No figure, no movement, no footsteps. Just the faint drip of water from the ceiling, the smell of mildew, the sensation of sweat on my skin, and the cold concrete beneath me. I stayed in the closet until I could hear my friends' laughter from upstairs. When I finally emerged, I took slow steps back to the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The hallway looked different in the dim light of the stairwell, smaller, less menacing. I reached the main floor, and my friends were waiting, joking about how easy it had been to hide. I didn't speak. I just walked to the exit, the night air hitting me with relief, the sound of the town distant but alive. The next day, I went back during daylight, partly out of curiosity, partly to prove to myself that nothing was there. The basement was empty. No tall figure, no dragging, no whispers. Just broken lockers, peeling paint, damp walls, and a closet that smelled faintly of mold. I never told my friends exactly what I saw. It didn't matter if they believed me. I didn't need them to. The fear I had felt was real enough. The lesson I took from it was simple. Some places are heavy with memory, with atmosphere, with time passing and things being left behind. You don't need a ghost or a monster to make a place terrifying. The school, abandoned and rotting, was enough. I never went back, and I never needed to. That night stayed with me because it was real. It was silent, slow, and waiting, and it reminded me that sometimes the scariest part isn't what's out there. It's the way your own mind reacts when the world around you stops feeling familiar. I never played hide and seek there again, and I never doubted for a second that what I had felt, fear, isolation, the sense of being watched, was entirely grounded in reality. The basement didn't need to move, didn't need to speak, didn't need to be haunted. It just was, and that was enough.